Welcome once again, one more week as we continue with this course on travel, on the world, on how to engage different countries, different cultures. This week we're going to talk about the point of departure, as the reading for this week indicates. We're still talking about our interconnectedness on the planet. This is the defining thing of the 21st century, without a doubt. And there's a concept that we're going to refer to called the global commons. What do we mean by the global commons? Well, it's the natural assets of the earth that is available to all. The idea of the commons used to be this idea of shared spaces, shared places. Think of national parks, think of state parks, parks in general. And more, they're becoming privatized, and access to or participation in comes at a cost, so we have to pay for them. But there still exists this idea of the global commons. There are areas that are freely available to all. We're going to start with an essay or an article written by the ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968. He wrote an article called "The Tragedy of the Commons." The Tragedy of the Commons. And what he does in this article is he proposes a story, a kind of a hypothetical situation. Imagine a group of herdsmen, right? And they all take their sheep, and all the sheep, they graze in the same place, right? And what would happen? What do you think would happen if each of these herdsmen decides to add one sheep to their herd? They all do this. The benefit of adding one sheep to their herd is reaped by the herdsman himself. But the cost comes, or there's a greater cost to everybody, because there's now more sheep grazing on the land. And so little by little, the land becomes less and less ideal for grazing, etc. And so the cost belongs to everybody, but the benefits of adding one sheep belongs to the single person. He ends the article with this quote: "Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all." This is, of course, in stark contrast to the idea that if I act in my own best interest, it's going to help everybody. If I have a company, it's in my best interest to provide a good service, to provide a good product, so that then I get more customers, so my wealth grows, my customers get a better product, etc. But it doesn't always work that way. So what is the solution? Is it collaboration? We have to talk, we have to understand each other. Maybe we take turns growing our herd. Maybe we decide that we're not going to grow our herd at all. We're going to be happy and content with what we have. I don't know what the solution is. But again, this is in contrast to the idea that if we all work toward our best interest, then it's going to help everybody. That's not always the case. So there's another term we're going to talk about, which is sustainable development. This is very popular, very common. We hear about it all the time. How do we do it? How do we get to a point where we have sustainable development, right? This constant growth that can lead to ruin or can lead to destruction. How do we come back and wrap our minds around sustainable development? This term first appeared in 1983 at the World Commission on Environment and Development. And the definition is this: sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Think again about the directive, the Indigenous directive. We thank 7 generations that came before us, and we're going to think about, or we're going to be concerned with the 7 generations coming after us. So we're going to meet the needs that we have today, but we're not going to condition, we're not going to compromise the needs that are going to come in the future. So there's some critical challenges that we face, that our global well-being faces: settlement patterns, population growth, of course, food production, energy, and of course, climate change. These are all global problems that, as we move away, or as we think about nation states or countries, we can't just deal with them as a country. We have to think about how the whole world is affected, right? I have to mention briefly Alexander von Humboldt, and there's a great book, great book by Andrea Wolf that's called The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World. It's a great book because it kind of it can serve as a sort of travel book as well. It tells his travels around the world and so forth, and so it'll inspire you as well to travel. Alexander von Humboldt, 1769 to 1859. This is when he lived. He's a German naturalist. He's commonly referred to as the father of modern geography. He studied not just the physical world, but also the relationship of humans to their environment. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about sustainable development. We talk about global issues. It's not just what it is, but it's also how it affects people. Von Humboldt wrote a book called Cosmos, and he provides the first systemic observations about climate and its relationship to geography. So again, great book if you're looking for another book to read. So we're talking about physical geography and human geography. Of course, physical geography, the earth and its resources, and then human geography, how humans interact with the physical environment. And it takes into account, or it considers, the political and the economic, social, and cultural factors. Again, we're stepping into anthropology. So where we live is not always a choice. We don't always choose to live where we are. Some of us do, some of us don't, or some of us had a few choices and we had to choose between 2 or 3 options. But this isn't always a choice that we have. Often in the United States, when there's a criticism, when you want to affect some sort of change, the response, again, my experience has been, well, why don't you leave? Why don't you go somewhere else? I want to urge you never to utter that phrase. Never say the phrase, well, why don't you leave? So again, think of borders. Think of how we're defined by our borders, and think too that these borders are always changing. They fluctuate. And this has happened in Eastern Europe. It's happened all over Europe. It's happened in America, in this continent. Borders are constantly changing. Think about the border in the 19th century. Think about the border between Mexico and the United States and how that border changed. All of these demarcations, right? We're talking also about population management. This is an issue as well. Note or think that every minute, population increases by 148 people. This is taken into consideration birth rates and death rates. Every single minute, 148 more people are born. Food and hunger, this is another issue that affects us. This is a global issue. Can the earth provide for this growing population? Is it capable of providing this much food and this much sustenance? There's a concept, carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the Earth's ability to meet the needs of the population. And again, we get into needs. What does it mean? It means different things for different people. Our needs might not be the same as the needs of the people in other countries or people that we encounter, other cultures, other countries, etc. So consider that as well. What are the things, the absolute needs that you have in your life? There's a phrase in Spanish that I love. I'm going to say it in Spanish for those of you who speak Spanish because it's much more poetic in Spanish and there's not a great translation in English. This is the phrase, no es más rico el que más tiene, sino el que menos necesita. And loosely translated, one is not wealthier because one has more things. One is wealthier when one needs fewer things. I love that phrase because it allows us to think critically about what it is that we have and do they add value to our life. And this is where you can cue the sort of the minimalists of the world and people who live in tiny houses and so forth. But I love that phrase, and it's a phrase that I try to live by, even though I do have children and they constantly need new things. But it does help to put things into perspective, I think, particularly when we travel. And you can think about it in different ways. You can think about the kinds of things that you need for sustenance in order to live, or you can also think about the things that you need as you travel. Do you need a specific kind of diet? Are you more adventurous and you'll eat anything, right? Are you up for the adventure? Where are you going to sleep? Where are you going to stay? I've mentioned before my travels, and I've traveled all kinds of different ways. I've rented a house in Guatemala, for instance, in Antigua for 10 days, and we lived in this house. But then my trek through Europe, my friend and I, we were sleeping under bridges and the craziest places off of cliffs and so forth. And not the most comfortable sleep, but a great adventure. I want to mention briefly the Malthusian Dilemma. The Malthusian Dilemma. And this has to do with the growth of the world's population and how that's geometrical. But the increase in food is going to happen arithmetically. So what that means, the current predictions are that by the year 2050, there are going to be about 9 billion people on this world and on Earth. And it is believed that the Earth simply cannot provide for that amount of people. That said, there are a number of projects, a number of people who are kind of thinking outside the box. Think about vertical farms, for instance. There are also rooftop gardens that are popping up all over the place in cities. So instead of just wasting this space on the roof, let's build some gardens. Even on the street, right, where normally you would see trees, let's put fruit trees. So there's all kinds of projects, people thinking about these things and how we can solve this problem. And also think that it's not always hunger per se, it's also malnourishment or undernourishment. So when we think about all of these things, we, as global citizens, we can think this is the reality, this is what simply happens around the world, or we can also think that maybe we are a part of the problem or we are contributing somehow to the problem in our efforts to keep the things that we need or maintain the sort of lifestyle that we've enjoyed up until now. How are we affecting other areas around the world? This is going back to Oxfam's definition of what it means to be a global citizen. Think about water supply too. Water is going to be a huge problem as well. 31% of the Earth's surface is covered by forest. Think that 46,000 to 58,000 square miles of forests are lost each year. And I love the text that you read for today because always when you talk about sort of thousands of acres, it's hard to put that into perspective. And so they always give you a comparison. The comparison is 36 football fields every minute, if that helps you conceptualize how much rainforest is being lost each year. Another consequence is desertification, which is the degradation of land in arid and semi-arid and subhuman areas. And this, of course, results from climate change, it results from human activity, and so forth. And typically, usually, as I'm sure you're aware, this always affects the world's poorest. Water, this is one of the most crucial, most critical resources for human survival. 663 million people lack access to safe water supplies, and about 1.5 billion people are affected each year by water-related diseases. And even in the United States, we've had an issue in Flint, Michigan for a number of years right now, trying to bring clean, safe water to citizens. Dr. Jeff Walters at George Fox University, this is part of what he studies. He's trying to study, or his work involves safe water that's accessible to people around the world. I highly recommend that you look up his work. So what has been the global response, or what can be the global response? You've heard of a number of these, I'm sure, but in 1992, for instance, the Earth Summit that was organized by the UN Conference on the Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. You had the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 that went into effect in 2006, and the idea or the attempt was to reduce greenhouse emissions. In fact, worldwide emissions rose nearly 40% between 1990 and 2009. So you had these efforts, but they're not really working necessarily. In 2012, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, there was a renewed commitment to a common vision to reduce greenhouse effects. Of course, we had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and this was supposed to be the summit to end all summits. So many countries signed on. China and the United States signed on. And the idea was the effort was to limit the increase of global temperatures to below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees Celsius. Many believe that this is not enough, but at least it's a start, and it might get us moving in the right direction. It was notable because they had countries set their own targets, but at the same time, there were no penalties for not meeting those targets. So many wondered if it was pointless. Again, China and the United States signed on, although the United States, as I'm sure you're aware, pulled out a number of years ago. So with all of these conferences, all of these summits, it's important, again, once again, to keep in mind that these issues are global. And so different countries need to work together. We as global citizens, we need to work together. We need to figure this out. And we also need to pay attention to our own carbon footprint. And there are a number of sites you can go to check your own carbon footprint and pay attention to how much you're affecting or not affecting. And the 3 R's, which I'm sure you've heard, I'm going to mention them again: reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce, reuse, recycle. These are good things to keep in mind as global citizens, but as we also try to affect local change. That, as I mentioned before, everything local is global.